Week 8 of the fantasy football season. Here's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking this week. Number 1, Ja'Marr Chase of the Cincinnati Bengals. So Chase, he's been back putting up monster numbers over the last few weeks since Joe Flacco's been traded to the Cincinnati Bengals. And this week, a good matchup versus the New York Jets. Sauce Gardner possibly could be out where he's in concussion protocol this week. And it just doesn't matter the matchup anyway with a quarterback who at least could get him the football in the right spots, especially coming off 23 targets in last week's game versus Steelers. He's going to have a big game once again, I believe, is Chase. Number 2, Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. Last week was a down game for London, but this offense plays better as a whole at home than it does on the road in terms of putting up fantasy points. So this week in a great matchup with Miami coming in, and we know they're one of the worst defenses in the league. I think Drake London bounces back in a big way. Number 3, Rashee Rice of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Rice, he came back and he didn't miss a beat, scoring 2 early touchdowns in that ball game versus the Vegas Raiders. And this week, a good matchup versus a bad secondary of the Washington Commanders, where CeeDee Lamb came back as well last week versus defense and had a big ball game. So I think Rice, him and Mahomes are locked in. He's a talented wide receiver, no doubt about it. And this week, in a good matchup, I think he puts up elite numbers. Number 4, CeeDee Lamb of the Dallas Cowboys. CeeDee Lamb, like I said, he came back last week, 74-yard touchdown, over 100 yards. Him and Dak have been locked in for years in this Cowboy offense. And this week, it's going to be a tougher matchup, obviously, with Patrick Surtain most likely covering him a majority of the Pickens on the other side. It opens things up for both these receivers. So I think CeeDee Lamb could go out there once again, even in a tougher matchup, and have a good game. Number 5, Emeka Egbuka of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So last week, very surprising, he returned from the hamstring injury. I thought he was going to be out at least multiple weeks, was Egbuka, but he didn't miss any time, and obviously youth is on his side. And now with the broken collarbone for Mike Evans, it opens up even more targets once again, and I doubt we're going to see in this ball game Chris Godwin come back. They'll give him another week of rest and then get him after the bye week. So this week in New Orleans, a defense that can't stop anyone. Obviously one of the worst teams in the league. I think Egbuka, after a mediocre game last week, bounces back with a big one this week. Number 6, Justin Jefferson of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jefferson, it's been an up and down season for him. Carson Wentz, he's going to start at quarterback once again this week in this matchup at the Los Angeles Chargers on Thursday night. And I think it helps the offense as a whole with Carson Wentz. I know he's a veteran. I know he takes a lot of big hits, turns the football over, but also he could get the football to his playmakers. And we saw it last week with Jordan Addison at the big game out of him and Jefferson. But Jefferson, we know, one of the best receivers in the league, and we rarely see 2 bad games in a row from him. Number 7, A.J. Brown of the Philadelphia Eagles. A lot of people that were panicking the first month and a half of the season, but now Brown and Jalen Hurts back on the same page, and Devonta Smith had a big ball game as well last week. So this week in a matchup versus the Giants, where you know they want to get their win back after a few weeks ago they lost in New York, getting embarrassed on Thursday night. So I think the Eagles, the offense is locked in. They went into Minnesota. Hurts threw all over the yard in that ball game, and A.J. Brown and Hurts back on the same page. Once again, number 8, Courtland Sutton of the Denver Broncos. I know the last couple weeks the numbers haven't been off the charts for Sutton, especially 2 weeks ago where he had a bad game versus the New York Jets. But this week, a great matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, one of the worst secondaries in the league. I don't know if Trevon Diggs is going to play in this game. He was out last week with a concussion, but either way, Courtland Sutton, I think with his route running ability and him and Bo Nix playing great football majority of the season, he's going to have a big game this week. Number 9, Garrett Wilson of the New York Jets. The head coach, Aaron Glenn, said there's a chance Garrett Wilson could play in this game. And I think with Tyrod Taylor in there, quarterback, Wilson might get even more looks. Even though I've said this in other videos, it doesn't matter who the quarterback is. Garrett Wilson's been going out there for years. With Zach Wilson, we've seen him. We've seen him with guys like Tim Boyle even go out there, put up numbers. So this week in a matchup at Cincinnati, a defense that can't stop anyone. If Wilson returns to the lineup, which knowing him, he probably will, I think he could go out there and pick up where he left off. Number 10, George Pickens of the Dallas Cowboys. George Pickens, it's been a great first season for him in Dallas. 6 touchdowns already in the first 7 weeks. And when CeeDee Lamb was out of the lineup, he was operating as the number 1 wide receiver, and he was putting up big numbers. So obviously the numbers are going to take a hit for George Pickens with Lamb back in the lineup for this Dallas Cowboy team. But still, he's a wide receiver. Worst case weekly, 12 to 15 fantasy points. But this week at Denver, I think we could see a high-scoring game between these two teams. Number 11, Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. So Flowers, the number 1 option, in my opinion, in the passing game for this Baltimore Raven team. Some people think it's Andrews, but at this point, I think it's Zay Flowers this week. A middle-of-the-pack matchup with the Bears coming in. But the whole key is if Lamar Jackson is ready to go in this game, and I think Lamar's going to give it a go. I know Baltimore 1-5 on the season, but they're coming off the bye. And Zay Flowers, he's been making plays all season long, and like I said, his upside is pretty solid. Is Flowers. Number 12, Devonta Smith of the Philadelphia Eagles. So the last 2 weeks, he's starting to kick it into gear, is Devonta Smith. And last week, he had a monster game on Minnesota. Had 9 catches, 183 yards, and a touchdown. But those ball games are going to be few and far between for Devonta Smith. But like I said, I think this Philly offense comes out early and often making some big plays in this game versus Giants after they got embarrassed 2 weeks ago, losing by 17 in that game on Thursday night. 13, Rome Odunze of the Chicago Bears. So Rome Odunze, the last 2 weeks, he's failed to reach double-digit fantasy points. I think this week he gets it back going with the Chicago Bear offense, and they know this Baltimore secondary and defense as a whole is banged up. So Rome Odunze, good route runner. Him and Caleb Williams, they've been locked in since their rookie seasons last year, and I think Odunze, after 2 bad games, bounces back with a good one this week. 14, T. Higgins of the Cincinnati Bengals. So this week a matchup versus the New York Jets. Like I said, Sauce Gardner possibly could be out with a concussion, and Higgins now 3 games in a row with double-digit fantasy points, including last week, 21 fantasy points. So Joe Flacco, old-school quarterback, gunslinger mentality, throwing the football all over the yard, is Joe Flacco. And they're making plays, obviously, is Chase and Higgins. And this week versus the Jets, we could see them go out there once again and put up numbers. 15, Michael Pittman of the Indianapolis Colts. So this whole offense has changed in one off season into this year, 6-1 on the year. Daniel Jones, he's making all the right reads, he's making all the right plays, and Michael Pittman and Tyler Warren, the top 2 options in this passing game for this Indianapolis Colts team. So this week in a good matchup versus a Tennessee defense that can't stop anyone and give up a lot of points. I like Pittman as a top 15 option. 16, Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. Chris Olave, possibly he could get traded in the next couple weeks at the deadline. Last week he had a big game versus the Bears, 5 catches, 98 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And this week it's a good matchup versus Tampa, where their secondary is leaky at times, and we've seen wide receivers have big games versus Tampa defense. So this week I think Chris Olave, in a matchup, they're going to be chasing points in this one. Get his targets, he's going to get some points, and he's been good when healthy, and he's been healthy this season. 17, DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So Metcalf a little lower on the list this week. Tougher matchup versus Green Bay, even though they've been giving up points over the last 3 weeks. He has this Green Bay Packer defense. But Aaron Rodgers, he's a quarterback that usually gets his number 1 target, the football. Last week it was a down game for Metcalf. 3 catches, only 50 yards in that one. But this week I think he'll have a better game versus Green Bay. But like I said, his ceiling just isn't as high as some of these wide receivers this week. The 18, Ladd McConkey of the Los Angeles Chargers. Ladd McConkey, the last 3 weeks, he's starting to get things going once again, where he picked up where he was last season as a rookie, making plays. But obviously this offense is loaded, and now they added another guy who's going to have big potential. Andre Gatson, over the last couple weeks, the rookies emerging, especially last week, 7 for 164 and a touchdown. So this offense has tons of weapons, obviously, tons of playmakers, a lot of youth as well. And all 3 of these receivers I like over there in Los Angeles, and weekly they're putting up points regardless of the matchup. And this week, even in the tougher matchup versus Minnesota, like I said, all 3 of these wide receivers are 18, 19, 20 for me, where last week we saw McConkey, he had 15 fantasy points. We saw Keenan Allen have a big game, and we saw Quentin Johnson. It wasn't a big game, but he did find the end zone. So all these wide receivers in this order: McConkey, Allen, Johnson, I rank him this week. 21, Jalen Waddle of the Miami Dolphins. So Waddle, he's had a couple good games as he's been operating as the number 1 wide receiver for this Miami Dolphin team since Tyreek Hill's been out with injury and obviously out for the season. And this week in a matchup at the Atlanta Falcons, where their defense has been middle of the pack, I think Waddle have a better game than last week. He'll get peppered with targets where he's the number 1 receiver. And also Darren Waller is out as well, most likely with a pec injury. 22, Deebo Samuel of the Washington Commanders. So Deebo Samuel, he's been good this season with this Commander team, but injuries, as usual, are plaguing him now. So he's going to have to practice a full week. Head coach Dan Quinn said for him to play on Monday Night Football is Deebo Samuel, but the whole week off and that extra day playing on Monday night, I think Deebo's going to go out there. And I know it's still early in the season, only week 8, but it's kind of crunch time now for this Commander team, where they lost Jaden Daniels for a few games early in the season. Now, obviously, Deebo Samuel is banged up. Terry McLaurin's already missed a bunch of games early in the season. So I think this week at Kansas City, he gives it a go, even if he's on a limited capacity compared to what he usually does. 23, Stephon Diggs of the New England Patriots. So Diggs, he's been solid for the most part this season, and it's hard to believe he's only a year exact off from where he tore the ACL, and he's been ready all season long from training camp all the way here to Week 8 is Stephon Diggs. So Diggs this week, a tougher matchup, obviously, in this ball game. It's going to be with Denzel Ward most likely covering a majority of the game. But Diggs, he's finding ways to make plays. Drake May, one of the better quarterbacks already in his young career. And this week, I think Diggs is still a wide receiver, too, for fantasy owners. 24, Jordan Addison of the Minnesota Vikings. So Jordan Addison, last week, it was a big game for him. He outdid Justin Jefferson. This week, a matchup at the Chargers. The defense isn't good. And also, as well, Carson Wentz, another start he's going to get in this week's ball game. So I think Jordan Addison, solid number 2 wide receiver, obviously, for this Minnesota Viking team. Solid receiver, too, as well, I think, for fantasy owners. 25 to Torrey McMillan of the Carolina Panthers. So this offense obviously takes a bit of a hit now with, obviously, the veteran Andy Dalton in there, quarterback. Bryce Young was making strides and playing good football over the last few weeks with his Panther teams won 3 in a row. But McMillan, impressive wide receiver, top receiver out of college this season. And this week in a matchup where they're most likely chasing points versus the Bills, I think he goes out there, has a solid performance. 26, Wan'Dale Robinson for the New York Giants. Robinson now the number 1 wide receiver, obviously, over the last few weeks for this New York Giant team. Malik Neighbors, he's out for the season with the torn ACL. So last couple weeks, Wan'Dale's going out there. He's making plays. Jackson Darts brought a lot of energy to this offense, obviously, for this New York Giant team. And I think this week, Wan'Dale Robinson once again is going to get his targets, even if Darius Slayton comes back. And he's a flex option. 27, Ricky Pearsall with the San Francisco 49ers. So Pearsall, he's been out a few games now for the San Francisco 49er team. We know he's a talented wide receiver. But this Niner team, they keep on trucking. Team 5-2 on the season. So this week in an okay matchup at the Houston Texans, I think they go out there and they can move the football on them. 28, Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Worthy definitely been a buzz so far this season, where he was drafted 5th, 6th round, and even early in some fantasy drafts. We know Rashee Rice is back now. Last week made his season debut, coming off his suspension, 2 touchdowns in that ball game. But this week a good matchup versus Washington, and I think Xavier Worthy, they're going to use him a lot as a deep ball threat, and he's a guy with a lot of speed, and him and Mahomes definitely have rapport from last year into this season. So we'll see if he can bounce back. 29, Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders. So McLaurin, he's missed a month now. This season's been a lost year for him, obviously, so far. Training camp, he held out to get his contract, got his money, rightfully so. And also, and now the injury's been nagging him. I thought McLaurin would have been back the last couple of weeks, but this week at Kansas City, where they're going to be chasing points, and we'll see Fitzdaniels or Mariota at quarterback. I think Scary Terry could go out there and have a decent game if he plays. 30, Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. So he's the one option in the receiving room, obviously, with Dalton Kincaid possibly the number 1 target in this passing game. But this week, a good matchup at Carolina. I know their defense has played better of late, but they really haven't versed, besides the Cowboys, a good offense over the last few weeks. Up till now, the Buffalo Bills. So Khalil Shakir, he's got good hands, good route runner. Him and Josh Allen have a good rapport. And coming off the bye in a bad loss in Week 6 at the Falcons, I think this Bill team comes out and has a good performance. 31, Romeo Doubs of the Green Bay Packers. So Romeo Doubs, number 1 receiver right now. Obviously, Jaden Reed's been out for a while with the shoulder injury. And Romeo Doubs, he can run the routes. He's a good deep ball threat. And him and Jordan Love have a good rapport. So this week in a matchup at Pittsburgh, where this could be a high-scoring game between these two teams, I think Doubs goes out there, has a decent performance. 32, DJ Moore of the Chicago Bears. So DJ Moore, it's been another down year for him this season, is DJ Moore. We know he's a good possession receiver, good yard after catch guy, but Rome Odunze is the number 1 option in this offense. And going back to last season as well, him and Caleb Williams didn't have a great rapport and connection. So this week here, good matchup on paper. Baltimore, who haven't stopped anyone this season, but still, it's been a low ceiling for DJ Moore. 33, Matthew Golden of the Green Bay Packers. So everyone waiting on the breakout game for Matthew Golden, and it could come this week at the Pittsburgh Steelers, where their defense gave up a lot of big plays last week to Jamar Chase, T. Higgins. Matthew Golden, he was a first-round pick, and him and Love just got to get on the same page a little bit more. But he's easily the number 2 wide receiver for this Packer team. 34, Juwan Jennings of the San Francisco 49ers. So Juwan Jennings, he's been banged up. Rib fractures he's had is Juwan Jennings. He's got a high ankle sprain and also some shoulder injury as well he's dealing with. But he went out there last week, 7.10 fantasy points. It was for Juwan Jennings. This week, an okay matchup with the Houston Texans, where they're middle of the pack defense. But like I said, with all these bye weeks, some of these guys, more weeks than not, don't hit the top 36. But Jennings does this week, 35. Tez Johnson, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 3 weeks in a row, double-digit fantasy points for Johnson. Scored a touchdown 2 games in a row. And obviously, we know Mike Evans, he's going to be out a while now with the broken collarbone. We also know Chris Godwin most likely not going to play, where they got to bye in week 9 is this Tampa Bay Buc team. And Tez Johnson, he has a good connection with Baker Mayfield. This kid's hungry, obviously a 7th-round pick where he barely made the NFL this season. And this week it's a good matchup on the fast track in New Orleans. And the 36th and final receiver I'm ranking is Troy Franklin of the Denver Broncos. So Troy Franklin last week got peppered with targets. What a comeback victory it was, obviously down 2 scores going into the fourth quarter and scored 33 points in the fourth quarter was this Denver Bronco team. So this week in a matchup versus a Cowboys secondary that can't stop anyone, and if the target's going to continue to be there, obviously, for Troy Franklin, it could be a good ball game for him. So that's the top 36 wide receivers I'm ranking for week 8 of the fantasy football season.